The chamber is open and full of whispers.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive timelines, members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. Magic does not choose its instruments cleanly. It does not send owls or produce convenient prophecies with tidy conclusions. What it does, what it has always done, across this island's long and violent and occasionally miraculous history, is wait. It accumulates. It organizes itself around the conditions it requires, patient as geology, and when those conditions finally arrive. It moves with the sudden decisiveness of a thing that has been still for a very long time. The morning after the war ended, magic moved. The great hall smelled of blood, old stone, and something beneath both, the mineral weight of a building that had absorbed grief for 1,000 years, and had, in the past 12 hours, been asked to absorb considerably more. Harry stood at the hall's center and looked at the ceiling. The enchantment showing the sky was gone. The battle had severed it, not destroyed the magic precisely, but disconnected it from whatever source had sustained it for centuries. The way a lamp goes dark when the oil runs out. What remained was plain gray stone, indifferent to the morning light pressing through the high windows. 57 bodies lay along the far wall under conjured sheets, each pressed flat by what it covered. Fred Weasley was the third from the left. Harry knew this because he had counted, carefully, after the last Death Eater had been taken, and before anyone had thought to ask him what came next. He had counted so he would know where to look and where not to look, depending on what he needed to do. He needed to not look for a while longer. Hermione had been sitting at the base of the south wall for 20 minutes when Harry sat beside her. Her notebook lay open in her lap. The quill rested between her fingers. Neither had been touched. He didn't speak. She didn't speak. The hall moved around them. Healers from St. Mungo's who had arrived at dawn. Ministry officials performing authority in a space that had no patience for it. Families who had arrived since sunrise with the terrible hope of people who needed to confirm that their particular person was not among the dead. After 10 minutes, I keep beginning sentences in my head and abandoning them halfway through, Hermione said. About what? About what comes next. She looked at the notebook. Every time I reach the second half of one, there's nothing there, which is unusual. Your sentences usually know where they're going. They do. She pressed the cover flat with her palm. I've never not known what comes next. Not once in my entire life. And now I don't. And I genuinely have no idea what to do with that. Harry looked up at the stone ceiling, gray, empty where the sky had been. The enchantment's gone, he said. She studied the ceiling. The connection's been severed, not the enchantment itself. Something fundamental changed last night. Not only Voldemort, something in the structure of the magic here. She set the notebook down and examined her hands. I felt it at the end. When you came back, there was a moment where something that had been pressing against everything wasn't there anymore, and the space it left behind was... She stopped. Waiting, Harry said. She looked at him. It felt like something waiting, not empty. Waiting, she was quiet for a long moment. That's the right word. The south wall wept at 11 in the morning. Harry saw it first, a line of moisture appearing on the stone's face, not from damage, not from any crack, but from somewhere internal. It ran downward in one slow line, catching the light for a moment before reaching the floor. He pressed 2 fingers against it. Warm, not blood warm or body warm, the warmth of something compressed and alive for a very long time that was now, finally, releasing. Hermione was beside him, in 4 steps. She pressed her entire palm flat against the stone and held it while Harry counted silently to 5. When she removed her hand, a perfect impression remained in the wall. Not carved, not pressed, but received. The stone having softened to welcome her hand and slowly returning to itself. The impression faded like breath clearing from cold glass. She turned to him wearing the expression he recognized, The one she wore when something had exceeded her existing categories, and she was constructing new ones in real time. The castle is grieving. Castles don't grieve. This one might. She kept her gaze on the wall. It's 1,000 years old, built with the explicit intention of 4 people who put themselves into the foundations. That kind of magic doesn't disappear when the people do. It persists, it evolves, it accumulates evidence. I think something is trying to communicate. With us specifically, with whoever is in the right place. She looked at him. We're in the right place. Harry pressed his own palm flat against the stone. The warmth moved, directional this time, traveling from the wall into his palm, up his arm, settling in his chest. His scar, which had ached at varying intensities for as long as he could remember, was utterly silent. Its absence felt like the silence after a sustained noise, more present than the noise itself had been. Hermione, I know. Something is. Keep your hand there. He kept it there. The warmth moved through him the way water moved through stone, not quickly, not dramatically. Following whatever paths were available. He was dimly aware of Hermione's hand finding his free hand, and when she made contact, the warmth changed, deepened, settled, grew more specific. It was looking for 2. It had always been looking for 2. The stone did something that stone did not do. It opened, not physically, not a door or a crack or any literal aperture, but the way a locked room opens when you finally understand what the key was made of. The warmth reversed direction, flowed back into the wall, and in its place came information. Not images, not language, but the direct transmission of something encoded in the castle's foundations for 1,000 years, waiting for the right hands in the right place at the right moment. The last thing Harry registered before the information became too vast to hold as separate pieces was the sound Hermione made. Not surprise, but recognition, encountering something larger than it had anticipated. Then the castle's message arrived complete, and he understood what it had been patient enough to say. It was not asking to be repaired. It was asking to begin again. Underneath that request, so old it had become structural rather than intentional, was the certainty of something that had waded through 8 centuries of accumulating evidence and had identified, in the 12 hours since the battle ended, the 2 people it had been patient for. Harry looked at Hermione. She was already looking at him. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then she said, in the careful voice she used when something was true, and she was saying it aloud for the first time, "It chose us." Above them, on the plain gray ceiling where the sky had been, a single crack opened in the stone. Not structural failure, not damage. And through it came morning light, directed and specific. Falling between them in a column that the castle had arranged with the patience of something that had been arranging for a very long time. The ministry arrived the following morning with 17 proposed forms and the energy of an institution that had survived a catastrophe and was responding by generating paperwork. Harry watched from the top of the main staircase for 4 minutes. Then he went to find Hermione. She was in the library, surrounded by scattered books and the damage along the eastern wall where a section of shelving had collapsed. She was not cleaning it. She sat at the central table with 4 texts open around her and 14 pages of close, rapid notes already completed beside them. Harry sat across from her. "The Founder's manuscripts," she said without looking up. "I found references to them in 2 separate secondary sources this morning. There's a collection of original documents, founding era, pre-ministry, predating the standardization of everything, held in a sealed archive beneath the library's lower level." She turned a page. "The archive has a specific access condition. It opens for air-level magical signatures. Does that mean us?" She looked up. The transmission yesterday, the castle's designation, if that constitutes formal air-level recognition, then yes, we can access whatever is in the archive. She held his gaze. "But first I want to address something. The ministry is downstairs generating forms. Kingsley has been confirmed as interim minister. There will be immediate and significant pressure to rebuild Hogwarts as it was. To restore it. A pause. The castle didn't ask to be restored. No, Harry said. It asked to begin again. Which is a fundamentally different project. Restoration preserves what existed. What the castle communicated was that the existing structure had accumulated enough of the wrong things over enough centuries that restoration would simply rebuild the conditions that produced last night. She looked at the damaged shelving. The house system, the blood status architecture embedded in the curriculum, the way the castle's magic had organized itself to reinforce division rather than connection. We grew up inside the wrong version, Harry said. We know what it costs. Yes, she said quietly, we do. Kingsley Shacklebolt sat at the library table and looked at them both with the measured attention of a man who had been minister for 48 hours and had already identified the difference between what he was being asked to do and what he should do. 17 ministry officials downstairs, 4 Wizengamot representatives, and an ICW delegation arriving this afternoon. Every one of them has a plan for Hogwarts. Restoration plans, Hermione said. Rebuild as it was, reopen in September, demonstrate institutional continuity, which is politically logical and probably wrong. He paused. I know the difference. What do you need? 3 days. There's an archive beneath this library, original founders' documentation, the founding compact. The actual intentions of the people who built this place before those intentions were modified by centuries of ministry oversight. She held his gaze. If we can access it, we'll know what this school was designed to be. Which is not what it became. Kingsley was quiet for a moment, looking at 2 19-year-olds sitting with founders' manuscripts and the unmistakable air of people who had received information that had rearranged everything they thought they understood. 3 days, he said. He stood. He looked at the window showing the castle's wounded grounds. Then he looked at Harry. Whatever you found in that stone, what did it feel like? Harry answered honestly, like being trusted with something that had been waiting longer than any person could wait. Kingsley nodded once and left to manage 17 ministry officials and their forms. The archive entrance was exactly where Hermione's secondary sources indicated, beneath the library's lowest level. Through a door so thoroughly concealed by 17 generations of Hogwarts librarians that it had ceased to exist in institutional memory. Plain oak, without handle or visible hinge, set into the stone so cleanly that in low light it appeared to simply be wall. Harry pressed his palm to it. The warmth moved through his hand, assessed something it found there, and the door opened. Inside, 10 feet by 12, low-ceilinged, the walls carved with a notation system predating Futhark and any standard magical script. The private language of people who had been writing for themselves because no existing language was adequate for what they needed to record. 4 stone pedestals, 1 in each corner, each supporting a document sealed in material that had spent 1,000 years becoming something unclassifiable by its original components. At the center, a single carved inscription. Hermione crouched before it and read aloud for the first time what it said. To those who return when the old arrangement has failed, we leave not the school we built, but the understanding of why we built it so that you may build it better. The weight of it settled in the archive's small space. Harry looked at the 4 pedestals, the inscription, at Hermione still crouching with one hand hovering an inch from the carved letters without touching them. They knew it would fail, he said. They anticipated the corruption. She stood. They built this archive for exactly this correction. The 4 documents, 1 per founder, aren't instructions. They're intentions. The actual thinking before it was institutionalized into something the thinkers themselves wouldn't have recognized. She moved to the nearest pedestal. The ceiling gave, not broke, but gave. as though the document had been waiting for this moment rather than resisting it. She read it standing, eyes moving rapidly across each page. 8 minutes later, Ravenclaw's document. She writes that the founding compact was explicitly designed to be temporary, a structure to be maintained until magical Britain had developed enough understanding to dispense with its most restrictive elements. She turned a page. She lists the elements she expected would be revised within 2 centuries. Were they? None of them. They spent 3 days in the archive. Harry read Gryffindor's document and found in it the grief of someone who had understood that courage without wisdom produced exactly the category of disaster the school's later history demonstrated repeatedly. The Gryffindor of the document bore little resemblance to the house that carried his name, not the glorification of bravery as an end in itself, but the understanding that courage was a tool, and a tool without purpose was a weapon waiting for a direction. He read Slytherin's document twice. It unsettled him in ways he had not expected, not because Salazar Slytherin had been monstrous, but because, on the page, he was not. His original intention had been protection, specifically the protection of those who had learned early that the world would not protect them, and who therefore needed cunning as armor. He had built his framework around a real truth and drawn catastrophically wrong conclusions from it. Harry sat with that for a long time. Hermione read all 4 documents in the order she determined made structural sense. Ravenclaw first, then Hufflepuff, then Slytherin, then Gryffindor, the sequence moving from intellectual architecture to ethical foundation to power dynamics to action. She made 67 pages of notes, and Harry could see a coherent whole developing in real time across those pages, the outline of something neither of them had been able to perceive before the archive existed. On the second evening, she set down her quill. "I know what the new school is. Tell me. Not a school that teaches magic to children, a school that teaches children to become the kind of people whose magic is worth teaching." She looked at her notes. The founders understood this. They built an institution designed to ask first what kind of person a student was becoming, and second, how magic could serve that becoming. Within 2 centuries, it inverted. The magic became primary, the person secondary, and the house system was the mechanism of that inversion. It sorted people into categories before anyone had asked them who they wanted to be. Harry looked at the 4 pedestals, the ancient inscription above them. "We need a location," he said. "I know where." She opened her notebook to a page she had flagged on the first morning. Hufflepuff's document identifies 4 geomantic anchor sites in Britain, where the Earth's magical current is strong enough to sustain a founding-level ward structure. Hogwarts occupies 1. There are 3 others. Have you identified which? A site in the Welsh mountains that has been unoccupied since the Roman period. 17 additional centuries of accumulation without a structure to discharge the energy. The readings suggest it may be more powerful than this site. She met his eyes. "We go when we've told the people who need to come with us." Who needs to come? The ones who were here. The ones who know what this cost. She looked at the archive ceiling, the low stone, the 1,000 years of waiting pressed into it. We cannot build a school without people who understand why the old one failed. The survivors of this battle are the most qualified people in Britain to answer that question. They stood at the center of the Great Hall on the 3rd evening after the battle and addressed the survivors who had stayed, the ones who couldn't yet leave, who felt the castle holding something they weren't finished with. Harry was direct. He had learned, across a year of running and hiding and making decisions in terrible conditions. That directness was not a simplification of complicated things. It was respect for the people receiving information, a refusal to pre-digest material into something more palatable. The castle communicated something. It designated us. Not because we're special, because we were in the right place at the right moment. There is an archive beneath this library containing what the founders actually intended this place to be. Those intentions are not what Hogwarts became. There is another site, in Wales. We are going to build what the founders intended, correctly this time, and we are starting immediately. If you want to come, come. If you don't, we understand. And this is not a judgment, he said. There will be no houses, no sorting, no pre-assignment of a person to a category before they have had the chance to become anyone. If the house system is fundamental to your identity, this may not be the right place for you, and that is honest information, not a condemnation, Hermione added. The room was quiet for a long time. I was sorted into Gryffindor and spent 4 years believing I was in the wrong house. I'm coming, Neville Longbottom said from the middle of the group. I always thought the sorting was a rather arbitrary way to determine someone's entire educational experience. When do we leave? Luna Lovegood said, tilting her head in the mild, settled voice she reserved for things she considered entirely obvious. George Weasley had sat in the corner through the whole address without looking at anyone. Harry watched him with the careful attention of someone trying to determine whether a person was present or somewhere else entirely. At the end, when people were beginning to separate into those who were going and those who weren't, George stood. He walked to Harry. He would have come. You know that, he said quietly, so the words stayed between them. I know. So I'm coming for both of us. 23 people chose to come. They left several days after the battle, stepping away from the rubble of a school that had asked them to be smaller than they were, towards something that didn't yet exist. The Welsh mountains held their silence differently from Scottish ones. Harry had grown up around neither, but the difference was unmistakable. Where Scotland's highlands endured, massive and unmoved, the Welsh mountains attended. They watched. Not hostile, curious in the way of very old things assessing what had arrived in their territory. The valley floor revealed itself as they descended the ridge, 1/2 mile of level ground, a river threading the eastern edge, and grass impossibly green against the surrounding terrain, as though something underground was feeding it from beneath rather than from sky and soil. The group came down into it feeling the air change, denser, more present, charged with the accumulation of 17 centuries of unspent magic. Hermione stood at the valley center with her compass, and Hufflepuff's document open in her left hand, conducting the assessment with the focused efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this specific task without knowing what she was preparing for. The primary node is 12 feet below our position, she said. Foundation work begins here, at the center, before the perimeter. She looked at the document. Hufflepuff's note says, do not begin at the walls. Begin at the heart. The walls grow from the heart, not the other way. What does beginning at the heart look like? Neville said, from the arc of 21 people watching. Hermione closed the document, put both it and her notebook in her bag, and straightened. She looked at Harry. The founding ward. We do it together. Walk me through it. The ward isn't a spell. It's a statement. We establish what this place is for, what it refuses, what it protects, what it costs. The geomantic current reads the statement and makes it structural. It becomes part of the land's magical organization, not an enchantment layered on top. She produced a single sheet of paper from her bag and handed it to him. The words matter. I've been writing them for 2 days. He read 7 lines. Each addressed one element of what the school would be, who it served, how it organized learning, what relationship it held with power, what it would refuse to do to its students, what it owed to the land it occupied, what it asked from those who came, and what it would never ask. The 7th line read, this place asks nothing of any person that the place itself is not willing to give. The 7th line, Harry said. It was the hardest to write. The others are principles. That one is a covenant. It's right. Yes, she took the paper back. We read it aloud together. Same words, same pace. The ward reads 2 sources in harmony as its foundation, not one person's intention but 2 people's shared intention, which is more stable than either alone. He turned to face the 21 people arranged in a loose arc at the valley's edge. Some of them looked nervous. George did not look nervous. He looked as though he had arrived at a decision several days earlier and was simply standing inside that decision now. Luna looked at the mountains with the mild attention she gave most things, which was not disengagement but a different quality of engagement. Everyone here is a witness to the founding ward. Your presence is your consent. If anyone is uncertain, now is the moment. Nobody moved. I think the valley is waiting, Luna said, with the mild certainty that was simply how she stated facts. I think you're right. Harry and Hermione stood at the valley's center, a foot apart, facing each other, because the ward was between them rather than in front of them. On 3, she said. She counted. They read the 7 lines. The words were not loud. Harry had braced for drama, for the visual evidence of something enormous occurring. Instead, the ground's temperature changed, not warmer, not colder, but different, the way a room shifts when something that had been suppressing it is suddenly gone. The grass at their feet pressed flat, and the pressing spread outward in a ring at walking pace, the geomantic current accepting the statement and organizing itself around it, becoming its structural expression. The ring expanded to the valley's edges. The mountains on 3 sides made a sound that was not quite sound, felt in the sternum, the vibration of very large stone responding to something that had addressed it directly for the first time in 17 centuries. When the ring reached the river, the water's tone resolved. Not louder, not quieter, resolved, the way water sounds when it passes from one geological state into another. The ward was in the land now, not on it. In it. George, from the ark, said very quietly, "Oh." Harry looked at him. George was staring at the grass where the ring had passed, and his face was doing something private. The expression of someone in grief who has encountered a thing that carries the same weight as what was lost without being a replacement. Harry looked away. That moment belonged to George, and not to anyone else's gaze. Hermione checked her compass. The needle turned slowly, no longer pointing north but toward their position, the geomantic node registering itself now rather than magnetic north. "It's stable," she said. "Is it what you wrote?" "It's more than what I wrote." She looked at the valley, the mountains, the 21 people standing in morning light that had become something none of them had a word for. The land added something. The intention met the place, and the place responded. The ward is ours, and the land's both. That's what Hufflepuff meant. Begin at the heart, and the heart includes what you find there, not only what you bring. She opened her notebook and wrote for 3 straight minutes. Then she looked at the people in the ark. Tonight we need shelter and fire and food, and we should talk about what we're doing and what we're each afraid of, and what we each hope for. Because those are the things that will either make this work or prevent it from working, and it's better to name them now while we can. That is a very Hermione way to suggest we sit around a fire and have feelings, George said. Yes, she agreed, with the acceptance of someone taking a fair characterization. It is. Fred would have said the same thing. I know. He would also have come. Obviously, the valley held them in its particular attended silence. Above the mountains, the sky had developed the deep, unobscured blue of morning over country that had been cleaned by recent rain, and the light it produced was the kind that made things look more precisely themselves than they usually appeared. The 23 of them, the original 21, plus Harry and Hermione at the center of it, stood in that light and looked at what was coming and were, each in their own way, already beginning. They built the school over the months that followed, and the land participated in ways that required 3 days to understand, and another 3 to work with reliably. The geomantic current directed the stone placement. Luna proved to be the most sensitive interpreter of the land's communication, an attunement that others had spent years misreading as eccentricity, and that turned out to be the most practically useful skill anyone brought to the construction site. By the 3rd week, she described the building process as a conversation, and nobody who had spent time on the site argued with her. Neville's relationship to the Valley's earth was different from Luna's, less interpretive, more physical, the connection of someone who had spent years developing an understanding of what soil wanted to become. Within a fortnight, he had established a dialogue with the Valley's western slope that resulted in the apple trees. They arrived overnight, or more precisely, they had always been in the slope's intention, and the founding ward had finally given them permission to be there. They produced fruit in their first summer, which was biologically improbable and geomantically consistent. On a morning in early summer, Harry came down from the sleeping tents, adequate canvas structures that knew they were not permanent, to find Hermione at the construction's eastern edge with both palms flat on the ground, eyes open, looking at nothing. "What are you doing?" "Listening," he waited. After 4 minutes, she lifted her hands and examined them. "The land wants the library first. Before the walls, before the great hall, before the dormitories, before the walls, the land's understanding of the school's purpose is organized around the library, not magic practice, not governance, knowledge, which is what I would have designed deliberately if I'd thought of it. A school organized around its library rather than the library being inserted into a pre-existing structure. Then, we build the library first. We build the library first. The architecture that resulted was the land's idea expressed through Hermione's understanding of what a library needed to do, with Neville's knowledge of how living spaces breathed, and Luna's ear for what the construction was telling them on the days it tried to tell them something they hadn't asked. 3 levels. The ground level for active work, tables, research spaces, a room designed for sustained engagement with material. The second for depth, rarer texts, foundational documents, the Founder's copies Hermione had transported from the Hogwarts archive in waterproof cases, carrying them with the care she reserved for irreplaceable things. The third level, the land's own addition. It manifested on the 9th day without appearing on any plan. The stone continued rising past where the roof should have closed, organizing itself into a tier lighter than the levels below, with openings in the walls through which the sky was directly accessible, and a floor that was warm and slightly yielding underfoot, registering the presence of anyone who stood on it with the attention of something very old. Hermione stood on this floor for a long time without speaking. "This is a reading space," she finally said. "We have a reading space on the ground level. That's a working space. This is something different." She pressed her foot gently against the floor's surface. The floor keeps something, a record of presence. The land is making a space for the kind of reading that doesn't produce notes, the kind that changes you rather than informs you. There's a difference? Yes, most of my reading is informational. I read to acquire material I can use. But some reading is transformational. The text changes the reader's fundamental orientation rather than their knowledge base. I've been in very few spaces designed for the second kind. Most libraries are built for the first. Harry thought about the stone in the Great Hall, the transmission arriving complete and rearranging everything he understood. That's what the castle did to us. She was already reaching for her notebook. That's the library's primary function, stated precisely. I want that in the charter. During the cataloging of the library's initial collection, 307 texts, selected across 5 days of careful assessment before departure, Harry pulled a text from the 4th case and stopped. "This one is in a script I can't read." She took it, opened it. Something shifted in her expression. Pre-founder. Pre-standardized magical notation. She turned a page with extraordinary care. This may be the oldest surviving magical text in Britain. She set it on her working surface. I can identify about 30%. It's a precursor to the notation in the Founder's archive, with enough structural overlap to work from. What I can read in the first 2 pages suggests it's a record of the magical education tradition before the Founders organized anything, the thing they were building on. "The thing beneath the thing was built on," Harry said. "Exactly." She looked at the 3rd level above them. "That text belongs up there. He carried it to the yielding floor and set it on a shelf that had appeared there on the 9th day alongside the level itself, as though the land had known it was coming and had made its place ready before it arrived. He stood alone on that floor for a moment, looking at the shelf, at the oldest text in their collection sitting in the space prepared for it. Everything rests on something older, he thought. The further back you can read, the deeper the foundation. The charter took 3 days to draft, 12 sections, 43 pages. Built around the distinction that the ward encoded the school's core intentions at a geological level, while the charter organized those intentions in language that could be read, contested, revised, and passed on. The ward cannot be revised, Hermione said on the first morning. Which is a feature, not a flaw. The core intentions are stable because they're structural now. But the human organization of those intentions absolutely must be revisable, because we will be wrong about things, and the structure has to acknowledge that without abandoning its foundation. So the charter changes, but the ward doesn't. The charter should change. It needs a revision mechanism, not easy revision, not revision triggered by one person with enough authority, but genuine consensus-based revision. She paused. Hogwarts had no revision mechanism. The founders' intentions were institutionalized into a structure that couldn't be updated, which meant every subsequent generation inherited the decisions of 4 people who had been dead for centuries, without any way to assess whether those decisions still served the original purpose. The governance section introduced what Hermione called rotational authority, not rotating which person held power, but rotating which domain of the school's function held governance primacy depending on current conditions. The assessment of which domain was primary was conducted by the land itself, reading the ward's response to the school's condition in real time. And if the people holding authority refuse to rotate it? Harry asked. The land suspends their capacity to make decisions that the ward registers, decisions that actually take effect in this place, until they comply. She walked to the foundation cornerstone and pressed her palm against it for 30 seconds. When she came back, her expression was the one he had learned to read as confirmation rather than surprise. It's already in there. The ward read the governance section as we drafted it. The mechanism is structural now. We didn't ask it to do that. We established the covenant. The land is keeping it. She paused. The charter and the ward are in active communication, and it goes both directions. The school isn't dependent on human memory of its own principles. The land holds them independently, which means future administrators can argue about implementation, but they cannot argue about whether the foundation exists. The succession provision. What happened to the school if something happened to both of them before the structure was self-sustaining? Was the section Harry had been approaching obliquely for 2 days. The governance structure is the human succession provision, Hermione said. A council of 9, 3 chosen by the students and residents, 3 chosen by the faculty, 3 identified by the land. The land identifies people? The same process the land used with us. Right hands, right place, right moment. It doesn't compel. It illuminates. The people identified can decline. But the land's identification is recorded in the charter as a legitimate selection mechanism because it turned out to be reliable. The charter was complete at 9 on the 3rd evening. Hermione copied it by hand into the journal designated as the founding document, the original, the one that would go below the cornerstone the following morning. Harry watched her write. He thought about Fred Weasley, 3rd from the left in the Great Hall. Who would have been here? Who would have found 12 ways to make this ridiculous and important simultaneously? Who was not here because the school they had grown up in had not been able to protect him? He thought about the 7th line. This place asks nothing of any person that the place itself is not willing to give. Hermione closed the journal. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Harry. Tomorrow, we set the cornerstone. Tomorrow, and then we build. And then we build. Outside, The valley held its particular Welsh silence. The river threaded the eastern edge. The mountains kept their watch on three sides. Below the valley floor, the geomantic current organized itself around the ward's 7 statements, already becoming something that had the quality of geology rather than enchantment. The land, below everything, continued its patient work. Sirius Black arrived 6 weeks into the building with a flying motorbike and the particular quality of a man who had come back from somewhere he couldn't describe and had decided that describing it was less important than being useful. Harry came across the site to meet him. "You didn't come because of Kingsley's letter," Harry said. Sirius looked at him sideways. "No, how long have you been thinking about it?" "Since Hermione sent the charter." He paused. "She sent it to everyone who survived. I read it 4 times. The 7th line of the ward." He looked at the library dome catching the afternoon sun. Fred would have come. "Yes, so I'm here." Remus Lupin had arrived 2 days earlier. He had survived the battle, not without cost, not unscathed. Having lost Tonks in the fighting and carrying that loss in the particular way he carried everything, quietly, with the precision of someone who had decided that grief and function were not mutually exclusive, and that choosing both was more honest than choosing either. He had come to Wales without announcement, walking the construction site for 2 hours before speaking to anyone. When he did speak, he went directly to Harry. "The library is extraordinary," he said, "and the foundation is deeper than the walls suggest. There's something below the geomantic work, older than the Roman-era accumulation, possibly Neolithic. Whatever you're building here, it isn't new. It's a return." He spent most mornings in the library from his 2nd day on, which was where he was most mornings now, and which was where, Harry suspected, he was doing the kind of thinking that required books and quiet and access to knowledge that was not directly applicable to any immediate practical problem, but was necessary anyway. At the evening fire, 6 weeks after the founding ward, the Marauder Guard was born. Sirius outlined its function in 3 statements: legal protection against ministry regulatory attempts, because those would come, intelligence about external threats before they became crises, and continuity, holding the Charter's principles if something happened to Harry and Hermione before the structure was self-sustaining. Lupin added a 4th, from where he sat at the fire's edge with his hands around a cup of tea and his gaze on the flames. "Witnesses," he said. "People whose specific function is to record accurately. Institutions get rewritten. The history of Hogwarts is a demonstration of that. We should control our own record, not the official version, not the version organized around what we wish were true, but what is actually happening, and what it costs, and what it produces. That's in the Charter." "Revised by end of tonight," Hermione said immediately. Sirius proposed the name, the Marauder Guard. He offered it carefully, as though he had been holding it for several days and was presenting rather than announcing. Because James would have come. Because Remus, he stopped. Started differently. Because the name belongs to people who understood that protection is not the same as control. The fire was quiet. Then George reached into his pocket and produced a folded piece of parchment. He held it out to Sirius. Sirius unfolded it. A small dog, a wolf, a stag, arranged around a stylized map marking, not the Marauder's map specifically, but the essence of it, the idea of knowing where things were, who they were, and holding that knowledge carefully. Sirius sat with the drawing for a long time. He drew it after the battle, George said. Before a pause. He drew it because he knew you'd come. He knew what you'd call it. He knew it needed an insignia, and nobody else would think of it in time. "When did you get it?" Sirius said. "He gave it to me the morning of May 2nd. Before the battle." George looked at the fire. "He gave me a lot of things that morning. He knew." The silence that followed was not grief exactly. It was grief that had been carried long enough to become something more complex, The weight of knowing someone well enough to have their drawings in your pocket months after they were gone. The particular mixture of loss and intimacy that came from being the one they had thought to prepare. Sirius folded the parchment with extraordinary care. Then, we're already named. After the founding meeting, Harry found George at the library entrance with his notebook open and his quill in his hand. Fred would have been better at this, George said, before Harry could speak. Fred would have been better at everything involving documentation and keeping track of things. Yes, George looked at the notebook. He had that instinct, the kind where you know that something is happening, and that the happening of it is the important part, not just the outcome. He could always see the moment that was going to matter. He paused. I can see it too. I'm just slower at naming it. Keeping the record isn't only naming things, Harry said. No, George looked up at him. The record has to be kept by someone who understands what it cost. I understand what it cost. He looked back down at the notebook. So I'm keeping it. Whatever went into the first entry of the Academy of Emeris's founding record was George's to write without observation. Harry left him to it. The ministry's formal position arrived in midsummer, 4 paragraphs, 17 statutory provisions cited, and a regulatory seizure of the Academy of Emery's site, scheduled for 5 days' time. The planning had been underway since the school was named, built quietly, at senior level, without Kingsley's knowledge, by officials who had survived the war and had responded to surviving it by deciding to reconstitute the exact kind of institutional control that had made the war possible in the first place. Hermione read the document once, set it down, and held still for 60 seconds. Their strongest ground is the Education Act, she said. One provision is genuinely applicable to our situation. Everything else is challengeable, and the founding compact predates the Act's relevant interpretation in any case. She looked at Harry. We have 5 days. And we have more than 5 days if we file the correct instruments today. What instruments? Challenge of prior claim with the ICW. It triggers a mandatory holding period, 90 days minimum, during which no ministry enforcement action can proceed against a claimed sovereign magical territory. She was already reaching for the charter. And we open in September. The room went quiet. We weren't planning to open until the construction was complete. The construction will be complete enough. If we have students enrolled before the ministry's challenge reaches tribunal, the practical enforceability of that challenge changes significantly. She held his gaze. The ICW is unlikely to enforce a closure order against a functioning school with students whose families have chosen this deliberately and with full knowledge. The political cost is too high. The best protection for the school is to put children in it, Lupin said from the library doorway. Children whose families have chosen deliberately, Hermione said. As evidence that the school is already what it claims to be. The ICW filing took 7 hours. Hermione drafted it. Harry and Sirius coordinated the Gringotts sovereignty documentation through Kingsley's office, Kingsley, who had been told and had responded with the controlled fury of a man outmaneuvered by his own department, provided access to the relevant treaty mechanisms with the efficiency of someone who understood that the access was both correct and politically necessary. The filing was submitted late in the afternoon. The holding period activated 2 hours later. The ministry seizure team stood down 2 minutes after notification, with the particular quality of people who had been prepared for one kind of opposition and encountered a completely different kind. Harry found Hermione that evening on the 3rd level of the library, sitting on the yielding floor with the founding document open in her lap and reading it, not taking notes, simply reading. He sat beside her without speaking. After a few minutes, we did something today, she said. Yes, something real. Yes, she held her notebook in her lap without opening it. The way you hold something familiar in a moment you want to stay inside for a little while before moving on. Commissioner Celestine Okafor of the International Educational Standards Commission arrived in late summer with 2 colleagues, and moved through the valley's construction site with the precision of someone who had spent 40 years distinguishing between the impressive and the genuine. The first thing she asked to see was not the buildings. She stood at the valley's center with her eyes closed for 4 minutes, while her colleagues waited with professional patience, and Harry and Hermione stood with the particular stillness of people who have been asked to demonstrate something they cannot adequately explain. When she opened her eyes, the ward is active in both directions. "What do you mean?" Hermione asked. "Most protective wards are unidirectional. They keep things out, or they keep things in. This ward is a statement and a relationship simultaneously. It doesn't protect the institution from the world. It establishes how the institution relates to the world." She looked at Harry with the attention of someone confirming a hypothesis. That's not conventional warding. That's covenant architecture. That was the intention. Intended and achieved are different things. Most institutions intend something and achieve a functional approximation. She looked at the library dome. You've achieved what you intended. That's rare. The assessment took 3 days. Okafor and her colleagues reviewed the charter in full, attended planning sessions, and spoke separately without Harry or Hermione present, to every person who had been at the site since the founding. On the 3rd evening, at the fire, I've conducted educational assessments for 15 years, 112 institutions across 43 countries. She looked at Harry, then at Hermione. This institution is doing what it claims. More than that, what it's doing is something I haven't encountered in my career. The coherent expression of an educational philosophy that traces to foundational thinking rather than to the accommodation of existing power structures. She let it settle. I'm recommending full accreditation. The Ministry of Magic's domestic regulatory authority is subordinate to that recognition. The seizure action planned for earlier this summer, and any future action of the same type, is legally without foundation. George, without looking up from the record, I'm writing down that you said that. I know, Okafor said. That's why I said it in front of everyone. After her colleagues retired, she stayed at the fire and raised the subject of a cooperative educational exchange, not competition. But 3 schools working together to address problems none of them could address from a single tradition. The format had existed in an older version of the Triwizard Tournament, before the collaborative model had been abandoned in the 15th century in favor of competition, because competition was easier to spectate than genuine cooperation. She described 2 partner institutions, a reformed French academy undergoing its own foundational revision, and Shule Yanguvu, a Tanzanian school 8 years old and philosophically aligned with the Academy of Emrys's charter, a school that had been building toward the same conclusions before the charter had existed. They've been building something parallel, Hermione said slowly, without knowing we were building it. Yes, Okafor said. I find that significant. That's what ideas do when they're true. They appear in multiple places at once, from different evidence, all pointing toward one answer. The idea was ready before the institutions were. We were just the ones whose hands happened to be in the right place, Luna said from the fire's edge, her knees drawn up and her gaze on the flames. Hermione was writing before Luna finished speaking. Harry watched her hand move across the page and thought, this is how the school extends beyond the valley. Not through conquest or promotion, but through convergence. The same truth emerging in different places, because the truth was ready. And because the world had been asking the question long before anyone found an answer. 47 students arrived when September came. Not through a train or a platform or any infrastructure the old model had relied on, through a system Sirius and the Guard had organized over 3 weeks, drawing on every mode of magical transportation that could be made both inconspicuous and safe. Portkeys for distant families. Apparition points at the ward boundary. A heavily charmed coach for families whose circumstances required roads rather than magic. They arrived through the morning, each arrival registered by the ward's boundary, with the distinction between welcoming and processing that Hermione had spent 2 days during the charter drafting trying to articulate, and had finally settled for noting as something the land would understand better than any language she could apply to it. Luna waited at the library entrance. 3 students went there before finding their dormitories, which was either a very good sign about the library or an indication that the signage needed improvement. Neville was in the teaching space with 4 trays of soil samples and the focused energy of someone who had revised his first session 6 times and was finally, genuinely ready. George was at the record, writing, by afternoon. The first real challenge arrived. A 15-year-old named Marcus Bellwether, transferred from Slytherin, father convicted following the post-war trials, spent 40 minutes alone in the valley's eastern corner before Hermione noticed the ward's registration of his emotional state and went to find him. She went alone, which Harry learned afterward was deliberate. Proximity required calibration, and the calibration she had made was that Marcus needed someone who would not carry the particular weight that Harry's presence brought. She sat with him in the eastern corner for an hour and 20 minutes. He told her 5 years of performing gratitude for conditional belonging. His blood status, mother a Muggle, had made him acceptable in Slytherin by the grace of his father's line, and he had understood since he was 11 that this acceptance could be revoked if he gave anyone reason to revoke it. He had transferred to the academy because the condition had become unbearable. But he had arrived to find no social hierarchy he recognized, no external signal telling him where he stood in relation to anyone else. He did not know how to stand without one. Knowing why a system exists and learning to function without it are different things, Hermione told him. Knowing isn't the same as being able to. How do I learn? By discovering what you value when nothing is requiring you to value it. She looked at the valley. You've spent 5 years performing preferences that served your position. You don't know which ones are real and which were strategic. This school exists for that question. Who are you when nothing external is telling you who to be? He was quiet for a moment. That's in the library inscription. Yes, the school's purpose applies to everything that happens here, not only to formal learning. That seems obvious in retrospect. Most true things do. That evening, Hermione described it to Harry with the honesty of someone reporting their own movement as accurately as they would report another person's. The hierarchy problem will be common. Most students coming from Hogwarts have years of identity organized around a social structure we've removed without providing a replacement. We need to support the disorientation, not simply create the conditions for discovery and step back. An orientation program, Harry said. 3 weeks at the start of each year, not information delivery. Structured exploration. Each student spends time in each of the school's spaces, works alongside different practitioners, and has one extended conversation with a faculty member about what they're noticing and what they're finding difficult. She looked at her notes. We start with where they actually are, not where we want them to be. That's teaching listening, Harry said, from the first day. Yes, she looked at him. Which is what we're teaching. 3 weeks into the term, the ward registered something anomalous, not distress, something more specific, a presence that didn't belong entirely inside the person carrying it. Harry noticed it in Daniel Avery, 16 years old, transferred from Slytherin, father convicted in the post-war trials. Daniel had been attending everything, missing nothing, present in every session. But for 10 days he had been somewhere else simultaneously, and the shift had begun the week the new archive materials arrived in the library. They found him in the Earth Magic teaching space, adjacent to Neville's room, empty at this early hour. Sitting on the floor with a journal open in his lap, and the expression of someone who had been looking at the same thing for too long without deciding what to do about what he had seen. Harry got there first. He sat across from Daniel on the floor and read the open pages of the journal without asking permission, because asking would have made it formal, and formal was the wrong register entirely. Hermione stayed in the doorway. My father's notes, Daniel said before Harry spoke. He sent it with me when I left. He didn't tell me what was in it. It's his account of both wars, his role in each, what he believed, how he understood what he was doing. He looked at the journal. He believed it completely. I knew that, but I didn't know the shape of it from the inside. Reading someone explain their beliefs in their own words is different from knowing they hold those beliefs. What did you find? That my father is not a stupid person. The beliefs have internal logic. They proceed from premises to conclusions I can follow. He looked at Harry. That's more frightening than if they were obviously wrong. Yes, Harry said. I spent 2 years working out that Dumbledore's intentions were real, and his methods were still wrong. I loved him. It didn't make the working out easier. It made it harder. He paused. The logic holding and the premises being wrong, that's not a contradiction. That's just what it looks like from the inside. Daniel looked at him. Hermione stepped into the room and sat beside Harry. 3 days ago, I went to the 3rd level of the library. I read something that challenged a framework I didn't know I was using. I've been inside my father's framework my entire life. It organized everything I understood about the world. I didn't know it was a framework. I thought it was just what was true. Hermione stepped into the room and sat beside Harry. What do you want to do with what you've found? I don't know. I've been sitting here for 2 hours trying to work out what to do with a world where my father's beliefs are coherent and wrong simultaneously. That's the hardest kind of wrong, she said. The kind that requires revision rather than rejection. I can't reject it. He's my father. Revision is not rejection. It's distinguishing between the person and the framework they used, releasing the framework while keeping the relationship. It's possible. I don't know if it's easy. I don't think it's the same for everyone. She paused. But I think it's the work that's in front of you, and this school exists specifically for people willing to do that work. Daniel turned to the journal's final pages. There's something else. Pages at the back, written differently. Later, I think. The handwriting changed. He held the journal open between them. Harry read the first 2 paragraphs. Hermione, she read. The final pages of Daniel Avery's father's journal contained something absent from every post-war intelligence report, every ministry file, every accounting of surviving Death Eater networks that the Guard's intelligence function had produced. A private record of a ritual attempted in the winter following Voldemort's first fall, not a Horcrux in the conventional sense, but adjacent. A fragment of consciousness preserved in a specifically prepared document intended to anchor a returning awareness. Avery's father had noted the ritual's failure with the clinical precision of a careful practitioner acknowledging an unsuccessful experiment. What he had not noted, because he had not known, was what a failed ritual of that type produced. Hermione worked through the night. Harry sat with her, present rather than helping, available while she worked through something that required sustained focus and proximity to another person. By 3 a.m, she had it. A failed soul fragmentation ritual dispersed rather than simply failed, distributed the fragmentary consciousness into the ambient magical environment, where it would dissipate unless it found purchase in something with sufficient magical saturation to sustain it. The Welsh Valley had 17 centuries of accumulated magical saturation. The ritual had been conducted in southwestern England. Magical currents in Britain ran northwest. It's in the valley, she said. In the river. 16 years of dilution has left it passive, not dangerous, not coherent enough to reconstitute into anything, but present, and the valley hasn't had time to metabolize something this recent. They went to the river at dawn. Harry, Hermione, and Sirius. Because the intelligence function had identified the threat and 3 people were sufficient for what needed to happen here. At the bank, Hermione used the ward's attunement to read the water. Sirius stood 3 feet back with the stillness of a man prepared to act, if action was required, and understanding that it was not. Harry stood at the water's edge. He thought about Tom Riddle, not the mythology, not the name built from terror and performance, but the person underneath it, A boy in a London orphanage discovering that he had power in a world that had given him nothing. Deciding that power was the answer to everything that had ever been taken from him. He thought about how that logic had an internal coherence, how the premises were wrong without the conclusions being incomprehensible. He thought about Daniel Avery's father, different origin, adjacent premises, similar conclusions, and Daniel sitting on the floor of the Earth magic space doing the hardest possible thing, choosing revision over defense. He crouched at the river's edge and pressed his palm to the water. He did not speak aloud. Through the ward's channel, through the Covenant's architecture, he directed what the founding ward had been built to transmit. This place asks nothing of any person that the place itself is not willing to give. He held it steady. The ward moved, the geomantic current traveling from the node through the ground to the bank and through the water, reaching the dispersed fragment through 16 years of dilution. Not a spell. Not combat. The application of a covenant to precisely the thing the covenant had been built to address. The fragment was the residue of a consciousness that had never learned to hear what the world was saying. The covenant was the expression of what the world said when you finally listened. They were not compatible. The river's character changed. Nothing visible. The water didn't glow. The current didn't shift. No theatrical evidence of anything significant occurring. But the ward's registration of the river moved from anomalous to ordinary. The foreign presence dissolving into the current, moving downstream, out of the valley, leaving clean water behind. "Is it done?" Sirius said. "Yes," Hermione said. "How?" The Covenant addressed it. The fragment couldn't persist in a place built on the genuine expression of everything it had always refused. She looked at the river. You can't anchor yourself to something that does precisely what you spent your life opposing. Sirius looked at the water for a long moment. Tom Riddle was afraid of the ordinary. Tom Riddle was afraid of everything that didn't position him at the center, Hermione said. And the Covenant. The Covenant positions no one at the center, Harry said. It asks what the place itself is willing to give. That's a question about the place, not about any individual. Sirius looked at him with the expression of someone who has known a person since they were small and is encountering, at a Welsh riverbank before breakfast, a version of that person who is entirely recognizable and entirely new. James would have had something to say about that. Something funny, Harry said. Completely funny and completely accurate. Sirius looked at the river. He was good at that. The river ran on. The valley held its attended silence around them. Below the riverbed, the land's accumulated magic continued its patient work, now free of everything that had been placed in it without its consent. Nicholas Flamel was over 6 centuries old and arrived at the valley on foot. He had been born in the 14th century and had outlived the Philosopher's Stone. The stone had been destroyed years before, as Harry knew. But Flamel was testimony to what occurred when a person spent centuries in genuine relationship with their own purpose. The relationship itself became sustaining in ways that simple longevity could not explain. He looked older than old and younger than he should, and the combination was less paradoxical in person than it sounded in description. He had come because of a letter from Hermione that described the discolored seam in the library's eastern foundation wall. Dark material, the color of old iron, running horizontally at waist height for 3 feet. The founding ward had made it visible, registering it as something in the foundation that did not belong to the Covenant's present, but had been part of the land's accumulated history for a very long time. Flamel looked at the seam for 30 seconds. Pre-Roman, he said. Late Bronze Age at the transition into the Iron Age. The magical practices of that period occasionally involved what we might now call soul-adjacent work, not fragmentation in any modern sense, something older and more approximate. Sacrifice of magical identity rather than magical substance. He looked at the stone. What remains here is the residue of a practice that hasn't been performed in 3,000 years. Can it be removed? Hermione asked. Removal leaves an absence, and an absence in a foundation is structural weakness. What you want is transmutation. He looked at Harry. Do you understand what that means in the alchemical sense? Not the colloquial usage. Changing the nature of a thing rather than its form, Harry said. Changing its nature at the level where nature is constituted. He examined the seam. This residue was produced by the corruption of magical integrity. Transmutation converts it from harm residue to foundation material that has acknowledged and processed what it contains. The distinction between a scar and a wound, Hermione said. Flamel looked at her with the attention of someone who rarely heard an important distinction articulated accurately on first attempt. Yes, he said. Exactly that. He set down his case. The working requires 3 practitioners, myself and 2 whose magical signatures are already in accord with the site's ward. It will reject input from anyone not aligned with the covenant. Harry and I, Hermione said, unless you object to 7 hours of sustained alchemical practice with a man who predates your country's institutional magical tradition by several centuries. I have approximately 50 questions about your alchemical method I've been accumulating since I was 12 years old. We can address them during the working. The practice is meditative, and productive conversation is compatible with the focus required. He looked at Harry. Your function is different from hers. She provides the intellectual architecture, the precise understanding of what we're transmuting and why. You provide the grounding, the connection to the site's covenant that anchors the working to this specific place and its purpose. This place asks nothing of any person that the place itself is not willing to give, Harry said. Flamel was quiet for a moment. That is an extraordinary covenant for an educational institution. That was the intention. I've known many educational institutions across 6 centuries, he said. They generally ask quite a great deal of their students while offering considerably less than they claim. He opened his case and began setting up his materials. The covenant changes the alchemical substrate. We'll see how deep it goes. The working took 7 hours. Harry sat at the geomantic node with both palms on the ground and held his connection to the covenant the way he had learned to hold things that mattered, steadily, without forcing. With the patience he had been building since the morning in the Great Hall when the stone had communicated and everything had changed. Hermione worked alongside Flamel at the library wall. The 50 questions she had accumulated were addressed across those hours in the genuine productive exchange of 2 people engaged in shared practice. She described her framework for understanding soul-adjacent magic. He refined it in 4 places and confirmed her in a dozen others where she had arrived at accurate conclusions through pure synthesis. In the 5th hour, the ward is alchemical, she said. Yes, the covenant established between us and the land, that's an alchemical structure. The relationship between intention and substance applied consistently over time. You built an alchemical school without knowing it. We built it because the founders' documents pointed toward it. The founders understood alchemy. It's in the foundational documents of Hogwarts, if you know what you're reading. He continued the working without pausing. The house system is the anti-alchemical element. Alchemy requires the integration of opposites, combining contradictory qualities into a unified whole. The house system prevents integration by separating those qualities into distinct containers that never need to encounter each other. So, the house system corrupted the alchemical intention from within. Within 2 centuries of the founding, the magical current Hufflepuff identified was already organizing around division by the 13th century. The castle knew before anyone else did. At the 7th hour, the seam changed. Not disappeared. Integrated, the stone's coloring returned to its natural variation. The darker material now threaded through it in a way that was not discoloration, but complexity. Visible evidence of something the foundation had processed and held, rather than something it was struggling to contain. Harry felt it through his palms at the geomantic node, the 3,000-year process accelerating to completion. the valley finally releasing what it had been slowly metabolizing for centuries. He pressed his palms flat for a moment after the working finished. The land pressed back, the response of ground that had completed something and was registering the completion. A breath, fully exhaled. He climbed to the library. Flamel and Hermione stood before the wall, not speaking, the particular silence of people who have done something difficult together and are standing in its aftermath without needing to fill it. "It's still there," Harry said. "Yes, but it's not a wound anymore. In 500 years, someone reading the magical history of this building will find a record of ancient corruption and a record of the process that addressed it. That is more honest than a foundation that appears unmarked. All foundations contain what was there before. The question is whether that history has been processed or simply concealed," Flamel said. He picked up his case. "I'd like to see the third level of the library, if I may." He climbed the stairs with the particular pace of someone who had been approaching difficult things for a very long time, and had learned to take them correctly rather than quickly. On the yielding floor, he stood before the shelf with the oldest text. He held out his hand. Hermione nodded. He opened the text and read for 3 minutes in complete silence. "Neolithic," he said at last, "before the founders, before the Roman-era traditions that preceded them, before any of the structures we inherited." He turned a page with extraordinary care. "This is the original understanding of magical education on this island. Before schools, before formal structures, before any statute governing who could know what." He turned another page. "It describes education as the process by which a person learns to hear what the world is saying." The third level was completely still. Flamel returned the text to the shelf with the reverence of someone placing something exactly where it belongs, and went back down the stairs without another word. Hermione looked at Harry. Harry looked at the shelf. "That's what we're teaching," he said. "That was always what we were teaching. We just didn't have the language for it." She opened her notebook to a new page, wrote the phrase at the top, and underlined it. Beneath it, in the smaller script she used for things that were final rather than provisional, she wrote, "This is the school's purpose." Stated precisely. Everything else is in service of this. Autumn brought its first external threat in the form of a shadow on the mountain. Harry felt it through the ward. Not an alarm, something subtler, the geomantic equivalent of peripheral awareness catching movement at the edge of what it could read. Patient, deliberate movement along the mountain's eastern face, staying just outside the ward boundary with the precision of someone who understood exactly where the boundary was and was staying carefully on the wrong side of it. Lupin's assessment from the boundary, after 7 minutes of the particular still attention he brought to situations that required more than ordinary senses, 2 people, not aurors, moving too patiently for aurors. Unspeakables, most likely. Documenting the ward. Their instruments were returning readings that made no sense within any framework they had been given, because the ward was not organized in any way their training had equipped them to categorize. Covenant architecture didn't appear in the Department of Mysteries' reference texts. It didn't appear in anyone's reference texts. It had not existed, in this form, for over 1,000 years. They'll report it as a malfunction, Lupin said. Instruments that produce readings outside established parameters are assumed to be malfunctioning rather than encountering something outside established parameters. Is that protective? Harry asked. For now. Confusion buys time. He paused. The long-term issue is if they send someone who can understand it. Can anyone understand it who doesn't already understand what it's for? Lupin considered this carefully. The ward encodes the school's purpose. To understand the ward, you'd have to understand the purpose. To understand the purpose, you'd have to be the kind of person who could genuinely comprehend why this place asks nothing of any person that the place itself is not willing to give, as a covenant rather than a slogan. He paused. I don't think the Ministry's unspeakables are generally those people. But someone might be. Someone always is. He looked at the mountain face. When that happens, it will likely be because the school has succeeded. Because it has produced the kind of thinking that can understand what the ward is. Which means the people who could penetrate the ward are the people the ward has educated. Harry stood at the boundary and held that thought. The ward as a test that was passed by becoming what the school was trying to produce. The psychological discomfort of being an institution trying to contain something that was building people capable of understanding things the controlling institution could not. They'll realize eventually, Harry said, that the only way to understand what we're doing is to send someone through the door who is genuinely open to being changed by it. Yes, Lupin said, and when they send someone like that, the ward will welcome them. The ward was built to welcome them. Below them, on the mountain face, the unspeakables continued their documentation. Their instruments continued to malfunction. The ward held the school, and the school held 47 students learning, on their 43rd day, what it meant to hear what the world was saying. The unspeakable who finally understood arrived alone, in a season when the mountains had turned amber and the valley's apple trees were producing their third harvest. Her name was Arabella Nightingale. She had been with the Department of Mysteries for 20 years and had read the founding charter, through a source she declined to identify, and the ICW comparative assessment in draft form, which suggested her source was someone with access to commissioner-level documents. She had a reputation for being interested in things that didn't fit existing categories. She had spent 3 years being given instrumental readings from the valley that her colleagues dismissed as equipment failure. She stood at the ward's eastern boundary and said, clearly, "I'd like to come in." Hermione went to the boundary. "The ward will register your intentions," she said. "It doesn't require my assessment. What does it look for?" Hermione looked at her directly. Openness to revision. Not the performance of openness, the genuine thing. The ward has been reading intentions for almost 3 years, and it has become very good at the distinction. Nightingale stood at the boundary for a long, considered moment, the stillness of someone honestly examining their own intentions rather than performing the examination for an audience. Then she stepped through. The ward welcomed her. She stayed for a week. She attended sessions as a participant, not an assessor, which was itself a kind of information it suggested she had understood. Before arriving that the school's content was not accessible from the outside of it, she spent 3 of those 7 days on the 3rd level of the library. She read the oldest text, which required her to begin learning a notation system she had not previously encountered. She did not finish it in 3 days. She took careful notes about the notation itself. She left without making any institutional recommendations, which was more significant than any formal report she could have produced. Her silence told everyone who understood the ministry's internal dynamics exactly what she had found, and exactly what she intended to do about it. 6 months later, the ministry's outstanding regulatory challenge was quietly withdrawn. No explanation was offered. None was required. The logic was available to anyone who understood what the ward was. The only way to comprehend the Academy of Emrys was to be changed by it, and the people who had been changed by it were no longer able to regard it as a threat requiring management. The ward did not protect the school by keeping out what it feared. It protected the school by making itself comprehensible only to the people it had already, in some fundamental sense, helped to create. The confusion that Nightingale's colleagues documented from outside the boundary, instruments producing results they had no framework for, was the most complete protection available. Not the ward's strength, but its specificity. Its requirement of genuine comprehension rather than force. An institution organized around understanding could not be defeated by an institution organized around control, because the tools of control were not designed to understand anything. They were designed only to contain. 5 years after the war ended, on the morning of the summer solstice, Harry stood at the valley's center before dawn and watched the light come in. 512 students. The number had grown from 47 through the mechanism of the genuine thing. Not marketing, not institutional promotion, not the kind of reputation that institutions constructed deliberately, but the change that students brought home when they came back for summers. The particular difference that people who lived with them noticed and couldn't fully articulate except to say, "My person is different in a way that matters. They think differently. They ask different questions. They sit with uncertainty longer before resolving it. They are more willing to say, 'I was wrong.'" 31 graduates from the first cohort. The 15 and 16 and 17-year-olds who had arrived in the first September and completed their education in the years that followed. Hermione tracked every one of them. She wrote to all of them. Most of them wrote back. She came to find him at 6, as she did every solstice morning, carrying her 7th notebook. "The ICW comparative assessment," she said. "I read it again last night. I read it last night too." She sat beside him on the low stone that the valley had provided, and that the school had, without instruction, arranged itself to face. The graduates of this school are performing differently from graduates of comparable institutions. Not in technical magical ability, in the capacities the founding charter was built to develop. Which ones specifically? Framework revision. When confronted with information that contradicts existing understanding, responding with genuine revision rather than selective interpretation, our graduates do this at 3 times the rate of graduates from comparable institutions. Twice as likely to seek perspectives that challenge their existing views without being asked to. She paused, significantly more likely to acknowledge when they are wrong. That's the hardest one. It's the most consequential. She looked at the library dome, catching the first light. The assessment also found something unexpected. The graduates are more likely to establish genuinely cooperative relationships across significant differences, not tolerant relationships, cooperative ones, where the difference itself is an asset rather than something to be managed. She closed the notebook. The house system produced people who cooperated excellently with their own type. This school produces people who cooperate well across difference, because they were never taught that difference was primarily a problem. Is that surprising? The intention isn't. The measurability is. She looked at him. I hoped it would be real. The assessment confirms it's measurable, which means it's real in a way that can be demonstrated to people who require demonstration. The cooperative exchange had been running for 3 years. Shule Yanguvu and the Académie des Lumières. 3 schools approaching the same problems from philosophically different foundations. In April, the most recent exchange had produced a solution to a ward construction challenge that had been unsolvable from any single tradition for 60 years. The solution combined the Academy of Emrys's Covenant architecture, the French school's precision enchanting methodology, and the Tanzanian school's relationship-based approach to protective magic. 3 frameworks that were individually insufficient and together adequate. George had the record of it, precise and complete, in Volume 11. Neville had become the school's Earth Magic lead formally in the 2nd year, the title arriving as administrative recognition of work he had been doing from the very first session. His approach had produced, by the 5th year, a field of study that hadn't previously existed, structured terramantic communication, the systematic methodology for human-to-ecosystem magical relationship, growing from his intuitive practice into a teachable discipline with a vocabulary and a curriculum and a set of principles that other practitioners could learn and build from. The ICW certified it as a novel magical discipline 3 years into the school's existence. He was 24 years old. He visited his parents every Sunday. Frank had strong opinions about fishing and shared them at length. Alice had rediscovered a talent for charms that years of damage had suppressed, and that had emerged, slowly, and then suddenly, and then abundantly, in the valley's particular air, as though whatever the valley did to the light did something similar to the conditions in which recovered things could grow. Luna taught magical perception. The course did not exist anywhere before she designed it. Its central premise, that the ability to encounter phenomena outside existing categories without forcing them into familiar shapes, was itself a learnable and teachable skill, had been dismissed by the British magical establishment as either obvious or impossible, depending on who was dismissing it. Her students consistently produced the most genuinely unexpected research the school generated. This was not accidental. George kept the record. 11 volumes now. The living document of what the school was actually doing, not what the institution wished were true. Not the version organized around institutional self-congratulation, but what was happening and what it cost and where it failed and how it addressed its failures. He trained 3 students per year in what he called honest witnessing, the practice of recording what was actually occurring rather than what ought to be occurring. He described it as the hardest thing he had ever done. He did it every day. Fred had designed the insignia on the morning before the battle. George kept the record in every morning after. Between those 2 contributions, one made in the hours before everything changed, one made in every hour since, the school had something most institutions never managed to build, and never managed to keep, an honest account of its own becoming. Daniel Avery was in his 3rd year. He had written to his father twice. He had received 1 letter back, short, careful, nothing resolved, nothing closed. He had brought it to Hermione's office, not to be told what it meant, but to have someone sit with him while he worked out what it meant. She had sat with him for an hour and a half and had not told him anything at all, because it wasn't her interpretation to give. He had left the office with the expression of someone who had identified the shape of work that was going to take longer than he had previously allowed for, and who had decided to do it anyway. Marcus Bellwether was in his 2nd year. He had been elected by his dormitory group to represent them in the curricular council review. He had sat in the first meeting with the focused attention of someone who was, for the first time, in a room where his presence was valued for something other than which side of a line he fell on. Harry and Hermione sat on the low stone as the valley woke around them, early risers visible at the dormitory approaches. 2 4th years already crossing toward the library. The 2nd year in the apple orchard with Neville's soil samples under one arm and the particular purposeful expression of someone who has found the work they want to do. The graduate cohort, Hermione said. 63 this year. Where are they going? The full range. 6 into ministry regulatory departments, specifically positioned to address the structural conditions that produced what we built this school to address. 4 to the ICW. 12 into research. 11 are going into Muggle institutions, not concealing what they are, but working within frameworks addressing problems that benefit from what they can bring. She turned a page. The statute of secrecy is changing. The disclosure framework is in its 4th year. The graduates of this school are equipped for a world where the concealment is finally over. We started building people for that world before it existed. You planned for that. I hoped for it. She looked at him with the directness she reserved for things she wanted stated precisely. There's a difference. Planning implies knowing the outcome. I knew the direction. I didn't know the outcome. He looked at the valley in the full morning light, library dome, teaching spaces, dormitories integrated into the landscape, the river running clear and free along the eastern edge, the mountains keeping their watch on 3 sides. He thought about 2 palms against warm stone in the wreckage of a castle's great hall, about the transmission that had arrived complete and rearranged everything, not asking to be restored, asking to begin again. He thought about what it meant to begin something, not to repair what existed, not to improve it within its own terms, but to return to the question underneath it and ask that question again with everything the intervening evidence had produced. It's working, he said. Yes, the thing the stone asked us to build, we built it. We're building it. She picked up her notebook. It's not finished. No, it won't be finished. I know. She looked at him steadily. That's not the same as not having done something real. I know that too. She was writing before she finished the sentence, the quill moving across the page in the rapid notation of someone who had been doing this for 5 years and had not once written something she didn't mean. The record accumulating in the honest way genuine records accumulated, not the official version, not the version organized around what an institution wished were true, but the living document of what was actually happening and what it cost and what it produced. The school woke around them. The valley held them in its attended silence. Below the valley floor, 17 centuries of accumulated magic organized itself around a 5-year-old ward built from 2 people's shared intention and a geomantic current and a covenant that asked nothing of anyone that the place itself was not willing to give. The light moved across the library dome as the morning progressed. 74 new students were somewhere in Britain waking into the last summer before they arrived, already asking, already beginning to listen, already starting to hear what the world said back when you finally learned to pay attention. Somewhere in Wales, in a valley where the grass grew greener than it should, and the mountains paid attention to what arrived in their territory, and a river ran clean along the eastern edge, and a library organized itself around its own 3rd floor, and a record was kept with the precision of someone who understood that keeping it was both tribute and duty. The world was answering. It had been answering for a very long time. It had simply been waiting for someone to build a place where people could finally learn to hear it. Later, when people asked how the Academy of Emeries had survived its first decade, the ministry's 4 regulatory attempts, the Assise political pressures, the graduated resistance of an established magical world that understood correctly that what the school was doing was dangerous to the order of things, the people who had been there from the beginning gave different answers depending on who they were. It survived because we had good lawyers, Sirius said. He was only half joking. It survived because we kept the record. Every decision, every failure, every correction. Institutions that don't record their own failures can't learn from them. Institutions that can't learn from their failures repeat them until the repetition destroys them, Lupin said. It survived because the valley wanted it to, Neville said. Which was the kind of answer that required years of terramantic work to understand fully, and that, once understood, was not as mystical as it sounded. The land had been accumulating the right conditions for 17 centuries. The school's survival was the land continuing what it had been doing all along. It survived because the idea was true, Luna said. True ideas are harder to kill than institutions. Institutions are containers for ideas, and when the container breaks, the idea goes looking for a new container. The Academy of Emeries was the idea finding a container shaped correctly for it. George said nothing. He wrote it down. What George's record showed, across 11 volumes covering the school's first 5 years, was something that none of the single-answer explanations fully captured. The school survived because the people inside it kept choosing to maintain the thing they were inside. Not once, at the founding, but continuously, every morning, every session, every conversation with a student who had arrived carrying something that didn't fit the covenant and needed someone to sit with them while they worked out what to do with it. Survival was not a single act. It was a practice. The cooperative exchange produced its most significant result in the school's 4th year. During a 3-week session with the Shule ya Nguvu cohort, in which the Tanzanian students demonstrated a technique for perceiving magical boundaries that none of the Academy's students had encountered in any existing European tradition. The technique was not esoteric. It was perceptual. A way of attending to the magical environment that had been developed in a context where the relationship between practitioners and the landscape was understood as primary rather than incidental. The students at Shule ya Nguvu learned it the way students at the Academy learned Neville's terramantic communication, not as a spell or a charm, but as a practice of attention. Luna sat in on 3 sessions of the demonstration, not as a teacher but as a student, which was unusual enough that several of the first-year Academy students noticed, and one of them asked her about it afterward. The most important thing you can do in any learning situation is remember which role you're in. I have been teaching magical perception for 4 years, and I still encounter things I can't perceive. It would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. And dishonesty is very bad for perception, she said. The student went back to the library and wrote this down. It appeared in the section of George's record covering the 4th year under the heading of things said by faculty that turned out to be foundational, a category George had created in the 2nd year when he noticed that the most important things said at the school were usually said in passing. In the school's 5th year, the ministry sent a delegation. Not unspeakables this time, not surveillance, not documentation, not the attempt to classify something that resisted classification. A formal delegation, led by a senior official named Alistair Pemberton, who had been appointed specifically to develop a working relationship with the Academy of Emeries under the new policy framework that Kingsley's government had formalized 3 months earlier. The policy framework was itself a product of the school's graduates working inside the ministry's regulatory departments, a long and difficult and non-linear process that had involved, by Harry's count, at least 4 instances where a former academy student had placed a piece of charter language in front of a senior official who had the authority to act on it and had said, quietly, "Have you considered whether this is what we're actually trying to do?" Pemberton arrived with 5 colleagues, 3 research assistants, and the specific energy of someone who had been told that this visit would be politically complicated and had decided to approach it with professional seriousness rather than institutional anxiety. He asked to see the ward first. This was becoming a pattern. Harry had stopped being surprised by it. Pemberton stood at the valley's center for 6 minutes without speaking. When he turned back to Harry, his expression was the expression Hermione had described once as the one people wore when they had encountered something that exceeded their existing categories and were beginning to build new ones. "The ward reads the institution's own conditions," Pemberton said. "It's not static. It's reading the school right now, in this moment, and organizing itself in response to what it finds." "Yes," Harry said, "that's what it does. We've spent 5 years trying to classify it," Pemberton said. "Our best people have produced 14 distinct classification attempts. None of them worked. Classification requires placing something inside an existing category," Harry said. "The ward doesn't exist inside any existing category." "No," Pemberton said. He looked at the library dome. "It exists inside its own." He paused. "I'd like to see the library." He spent 4 hours there, 2 of them on the 3rd level. When he came down, Hermione was waiting for him in the ground-level working space with tea and the founding charter open to the external relations section. They talked for 3 hours. What emerged from those 3 hours was not an agreement. The ministry's position and the academy's position were not yet reconcilable, and Pemberton was honest enough to say so directly, which Harry regarded as the most promising thing about him. What emerged was a shared understanding of where the irreconcilability lay, which was the necessary precondition for eventually reconciling it. At the end of the conversation, Pemberton looked at the charter's external relations section. "You wrote that the graduates of this institution should be equipped to navigate multiple worlds without losing coherence in either. And you wrote that you anticipated the statute of secrecy would change," he said. "Yes," Hermione said. "When you wrote it, the statute's revision was not ministry policy. It was not ICW policy. It was not on any official agenda anywhere in the wizarding world." "No," she said. "It wasn't." He looked at her. "How did you know?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because the evidence pointed that way. The magical world and the non-magical world have been in proximity for long enough that genuine concealment has become increasingly implausible. The statute was designed for conditions that no longer exist. We built graduates for the conditions that were coming rather than the conditions that were current, because the conditions that were coming were more real than the conditions that were current." She paused. "We weren't predicting. We were reading." Pemberton nodded slowly. "That's what the library is for," he said. the process by which a person learns to hear what the world is saying. She looked at him with the attention she gave people who had understood something correctly. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly what it's for." He left that evening with his delegation, and the record George made of his visit was 12 pages, the longest single entry in volume 11. Harry read it the following morning and found, in George's precise and unhurried prose, not a summary of what had been said, but the actual shape of how the conversation had moved, where it had encountered resistance, where the resistance had softened, where something had been said that changed the quality of what came after it. He found George in the library, at the table he used most mornings. "The entry on Pemberton," Harry said. "Yes," George said. "It's extraordinary. It's accurate." He looked at Harry. "That's the same thing, done properly." Harry sat down across from him. Fred would have been proud of the record, Harry said. George was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of someone for whom a statement like this required its own kind of time. "Fred would have said the record was too solemn," George said finally. "He would have said it needed more jokes." He looked at his notebook. He would have been right. "I've been trying to figure out how to write humor into accurate institutional documentation for 5 years, and I haven't solved it yet. Maybe that's the next discipline," Harry said. After Terramantic communication. Humorous institutional record-keeping. George looked at him. "That's the most ridiculous thing you've said in years," George said. Fred would have loved it. He wrote it down. The first graduation happened in the school's second year. The students who had arrived at 15, 16, 17, and had completed their education in 18 months of intensive, structure-defying learning that had no direct equivalent in any previous model of magical education. 31 of them. Harry had expected a ceremony. What happened instead was a gathering, an evening fire, the valley around them, everyone who had been at the school from the beginning sitting or standing in the same loose formations they always used. The graduates sat among them, rather than apart from them, which was itself something. No platform, no separation, no distinction between those who had finished and those who had not. Because the graduating students were not leaving. They were extending outward. The education was not ending, it was finding new forms. Hermione spoke. She had been writing her remarks for 3 weeks, and had rewritten them 6 times, and had finally set aside the written version the morning of the gathering, and spoken from what she knew instead of from what she had prepared, which was itself the demonstration of something she had been trying to teach. The test of whether we built what we intended is not in this room tonight. It's not in the ICW's assessment or the ministry's response or the cooperative exchange outcomes or any metric we can point to. The test is in what you do when you encounter something that contradicts your deepest assumption about how the world works, and when you have to decide whether to defend that assumption or revise it. That decision will happen privately, without ceremony, without anyone measuring it. But it will determine everything that matters about the kind of world we're all living in, she said. She stopped there. She had originally written more. She had cut it because everything that needed to be said had been said. "She's right," Neville said quietly, sitting to Harry's left. "She usually is," Harry said. "Not usually," Neville said. "Almost always. There's a difference." He paused. "I was wrong about that for years. I thought she was just very good at being right. But it's not about being right. It's about how she listens to the problem before she tries to answer it. She listens longer than anyone else does." Harry looked at him. "How long have you been thinking about that?" "Since the first year," Neville said. "I've been trying to do it with soil." "Listen longer. You find things in soil that you'd never find if you just asked it what you wanted to know." He paused. "Frank, my father, on his good days, he talks about fishing the same way. He says the fish tell you where they are if you stop telling the water what you expect." Harry thought about that for a moment. He thought about the stone in the great hall pressing information into his palm. He thought about what the stone had been doing all along, for 8 centuries, accumulating evidence, trying to communicate, waiting for someone who had learned to listen long enough. "That's what we're teaching," Harry said. "Yes," Neville said. "I think it is." The fire burned lower. The mountains watched. 31 graduates sat among them in the valley that had been waiting 17 centuries for exactly this kind of evening. Not a conclusion, not a ceremony, not an end to anything, but the moment when what had been building inside the valley's deep accumulation of magical intention finally found its outward form and began, in earnest, to move through the world. The world, Harry thought, was about to encounter 31 people who had learned to hear it. That was enough for one evening. That was, in fact, considerably more than enough. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.